Today I'd like to speak about the idea of deconstruction, which means a critical analysis of philosophical and literary language. So what I want to do is try to convey the sense of being in the world without knowledge, without language, without words and images stored in the memory. So if we see a child running around, we don't give it a label, we just see the child running around and it's in the world. We could say that the child's experiencing the world, or being in the world, or looking at the world, but really it's simply the child in the world, or the tree in the world, or the adult in the world. You know, you see people walking around you all the time. You don't necessarily see people walking around as labels, or thinking, I wonder what they're experiencing, I wonder what they're thinking, etc. No, they're just, human beings walking around. So whether you go to you go to Australia and there's Aboriginals walking around, there are modern people walking around, etc. And from that, I would say that the most basic language I would use, if I was to use a language, I would just say the self, each self, is in the one. So each self is in life, each self is in reality, each self is being itself in the world. So that's a kind of basic language. That would be what I think is the case when we're living in the world. I think, as I just said, that you see other people, you see older people, younger people, you see children, and we just see each other. And I feel that when we see each other without the screen of consciousness and language, I think we're just seeing each other self to self, one to one, and we're all in the one life, we're all in the one, on the one planet, we're all in the one universe, as it were. And I do think that is really what is actually going on. But nobody talks about it. We don't talk about it. But I do think that is what's going on. So you might say, from that spiritual position, we're all being quite natural. We're all just being ourselves. Now, when we grow up, the child obviously begins to see itself in terms of language. It distinguishes itself from other people by developing a special kind of language limited to their memory. So like you could say, each book you read is a different kind of memory. And so you say each individual person has a different kind of memory. And the experience and the knowledge is stored in different ways. And each individual remembers certain things about its life. And when we want to work out the meaning of life, when we want to reflect on the purpose of life, then we've got all that baggage. We've got all the accumulated baggage of memory, knowledge and experience. And it's a very daunting project by the time you're 20 years old to work things out. And I think that relatively few people do actually begin to work things out. I think the momentum of society and a career, family, getting a house, etc., I think that just occupies people's life. And maybe when they're much older, maybe they will reflect on life and its meaning. But for those teenagers and younger people, maybe having an experience that puts them in a more spiritual position, then being exposed to all these sacred texts, that becomes a further complication, a further confusion, and people try different things, and maybe they settle for a particular sacred text, a particular form of meditation, etc. I mean, basically, when you're working things out in your consciousness, you're really shuffling around the cards. You're taking different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, or maybe many jigsaw puzzles, and you're moving the pieces around, and you settle for a particular picture, or a particular image of yourself, or an ideal state that you think that suits you. So you read about the Tao, or you read about Advaita non-duality. As in my own case, I was very interested in Krishnamurti and Carl Jung, as well as Gurdjieff, Uspensky. And because you're still in a conditioned state of mind by society, you try to make what you're interested in fit into society. You want that to become a part of society. So what happens is that you see the spiritual aspect as a tradition, as an institution. So you can belong to an institution that's integral to society. And then people set up institutions in the New Age, and they become integral to the New Age society, but it's still an extension of the old society. And then things become formulated and even fossilized, so that maybe you're no longer learning, but you're settling for a particular kind of language, a particular kind of interpretation of an experience. And the deeper aspect of spirituality, and especially the distinction between the self and the ego, maybe that deep philosophical inquiry, which I'm saying involves deconstruction, involves breaking down the language, breaking down the identification, breaking free of, you might say, institutionalized thought, which is really basically the memory itself. I mean, the memory being, you might say, the very roots of tradition. So everything in the memory as language has come from the past. It's made up of the language of the human species. I mean, it's made up of lots of different kinds of languages, but it's still the language that identifies you with the human species. Just like people today, they want to be identified with globalization. People want to be part of something, they want to belong to something, they want to feel secure, they want to feel like they're in the know. But of course that's the ego-bound consciousness that, in a sense, collectively contains all egos. Then you have a pyramidal hierarchy within the institutions. So even in the New Age you have all kinds of hierarchies. There are people going around saying they're enlightened, or they've got the answer, and they can lead you to the true nature of the self, or the true nature of reality, etc. And how do you know who's telling the truth? And can you trust yourself in making an assessment of who's telling the truth? What's your ground for telling the truth? So it seems to me that unless you've discovered the distinction between ego and self, there's no way that you can, in a sense, validate another person. And after all, the only thing you've got to go by is the language that that person is using. And they may be very adept at using language in a very self-deceptive way, and only appear to be free, as it were, or appear to be at one within themselves, because they're very good at using language. And why would anybody want to use language to manipulate other people into thinking the way they think? And that's the trouble with groups and cults and institutionalizing spirituality, when the very nature of spirituality should represent freedom. Not freedom from ego, from consciousness, but just freedom in itself. The child running around, the animal running around in freedom. You don't have to express it or explain it or justify it, just the fact of freedom. Because in identity and consciousness, you're always free from something. You're always moving from one thing to another, being free of this and free of that. But there's no inherent freedom within consciousness and language. That's why I try to simplify by philosophically reducing all descriptions and interpretations and language to a very simple, basic principle of the one. And when I've seen that represented by other people, like the Tao is the great one, and Buddha in Nirvana is the one mind, and Plato and Plotinus, they talk about the one. in ancient Egypt, Thoth is the one, and I think that's a very good, I would say that fits the way I feel about self as one. I mean, that seems to be a very good idea and has lots of subtle meanings. Because if you think of the planet as being one, Gaia, or the world as being one, the universe as being one, the tree as being one, reality as a whole being one. So the idea that there is a thing called the one, that actually makes sense to me. And if you say the one is zero, is nothing, then it's not freedom from anything, it's freedom in itself, because it's nothing and it's eternal and it's not infinite, because infinity is ever in expansion, in extension of itself. But eternity, being the circle, being naught or no thing, then it's not going anywhere. It's not going away from anything, it's not going towards anything like infinity. So infinity would be applied to the universe, it's an infinite universe. And if you think of all the things in reality, trees and dreams and colours and numbers and images, hypothetically they're all infinite. They're all, you can reproduce them, just like you can reproduce the identity of the ego. The I can be reproduced indefinitely in consciousness as a product of the imagination, which is you can imagine anything you like. So that very process of infinity is synonymous with the imagination that can imagine anything it likes. So you could say that science, when it talks about the universe, uses ideas like infinity, which parallel the activity of the imagination in consciousness. And the very idea of infinity comes from consciousness. And then the spiritual idea, the religious spiritual idea of eternity, is not acceptable to science. The idea that there's something other in itself than the universe, than the material universe, is not a consideration. Whereas to me, it would be the most obvious thing. The most obvious thing would be that if you take the concept of the material universe as an infinite universe, which means infinite, there must be a finite aspect. So you could say the infinite and the finite go together. And in a sense, then what's beyond that? What enfolds that? What's holding it together? What's the container of the whole totality of reality? I would say the one, as a principle. Philosophically, it makes sense. And also the idea of, say, the Big Bang, starting from a very infinitesimal point, like the seed of the universe, like the seed of an oak tree. You've got the seed of the universe in the Big Bang, and it's, you might say, splits apart like a cell and reproduces. So you could say, what is before the moment of the Big Bang? Where did that come from? And then you say, it's a moment out of nothing. And what is the nothing but the one? So even there you could say philosophically it makes sense to say that there's the one, but the one isn't nothing in compared to something. So if the universe of things is something, there are lots of things that's something, then the one is no thing. So it's not comparing itself to the universe as if it's caused the universe. No, the Big Bang has caused the universe. From the seed, that's caused the oak tree to grow. And if you think of the one or no thing, then what is the relationship of the one to the universe, or the one to reality? Whether that's multiverses or multi-dimensions, like dreams and the psyche and everything else. So, breaking down ideas like this, breaking down structures, ideologies, belief systems, power structures, and going back to some origin, going back to some source, so that you could say in the child, that child is fully aware without language. So if you compare the beginnings of language, A, B, C, as the Big Bang, so A, B, C, so the cell divides to form the body, and you could say language forms in terms of consciousness and memory. So the child, in its kind of innocence, its openness, its freedom, its oneness, suddenly it's speaking. So what was going on in the child before that? It wasn't, I mean, the child wasn't stupid, the child wasn't confused, the child was just alive with itself, and it was one, and you know, so even if you say, I mean, if you think, is the child in a spiritual dimension of the one? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it's still one. The child is still one. And that means that at some point, what we call consciousness, which is to do with language and memory and experience and knowledge, you could say that when the child was experiencing the world, as it were, taking in all the sensations and exposed to other people with language and all the meanings of the objects and the books around the child doesn't have any knowledge of that. And so you could say, and yet the child is functioning intelligently. In potential, there's a kind of potential intelligence in the child, and it's living in the world with all these impressions, but they're not yet experiences that are coded in the memory and form the language which comes later. So you can't ask the child before it's speaking, as it were, I mean, or let's put it this way, when the child begins to talk and develops a language, and you say, well, what was it like before you could talk? Well, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. There'd be absolutely no memory of that. So I'll give an example of my own life, as it were. When I'm sitting here now, and I'm looking out at the scene, the buildings and the trees and the sky, my sense of self, looking out there, in this state of oneness, can do that without consciousness. That means I can do that in all innocence, as it were, without reference to language, consciousness, or identity. So if somebody comes into the room that I know, they know me and they know what to expect, that I'm going to say certain things and we're going to talk about certain things. That's my identity to the person I know. But when they're not here and I'm just sitting here looking out of the window, that identity doesn't exist, only in my memory. So when that person comes, I use my memory. But when I'm on my own, I don't have to use my memory or my consciousness or my identity. So I can, for myself, validate what the child might be experiencing before language comes into being. But of course, the child, you could say, before language and memory start to operate, there is no experience. You need an experiencer, you need an ego, an identity to have the experience, and then you can talk about the meaning of that experience in terms of language. So you could say, before language forms in the child, what is the child's identity? And does it need an identity? I mean, in the illness or disease called Alzheimer's, people become aware sometimes in their 40s and 50s that they're losing their memory. Let's say that they're losing their memory, and there's a really good example of that in terms of my own life, as it were. I mean, in Oxford there was a novelist and a philosopher at the university called Iris Murdoch. And I used to live just around the corner from her, and I used to see her. And her philosophy was existentialism, and she was very interested in Buddhism. And she also did a lot of interviews with Krishnamurti. And these are all influences that are very, that I feel very close to. Her interests were my interest, as it were. I never got to talk to her, unfortunately, but she wrote a book on Sartre, the existentialist Sartre, who lived in Paris in the 40s and the 50s, and was the key figure in existentialism that began in the 18th century with Kierkegaard and Hegel, and there was Heidegger and other existentialists. But in the modern period, he wrote a book called Being and Nothingness. And I read the book, and I can't really talk about the details, but just from that title, you've got an existentialist who's not religious, not spiritual. He's basically a materialist. He just lives in this world, and he'll live and he'll die. And the existentialist is interested in what's called phenomenology. So his experience of the world as an existentialist meant that he would only deal with what he experienced in the real world, in the world around him. So whatever he experienced with other people, whatever he experienced in nature and the physical universe, that was his domain. That's all he wrote about, that's all he talked about. So he never went into metaphysics. And yet he writes a book called Being and Nothingness. And he's saying that your sense of self really rests in nothingness. And that's very similar to the idea that self rests in the one. So in a way, I have no problem with the idea that the self rests in the one or rests in nothingness. And because I haven't come to a conclusion about whether I survive or not. I don't have any proof to myself that I survive this physical world, that when I die, I die. I don't have any absolute proof that I will live beyond that. I think I will, and I think some of my experiences and visions and other things like that kind of make me feel that I will, but I don't know. So I'm quite easy with the idea that the being of yourself, the ground of your being, is in nothingness. Well, obviously Iris Murdoch was fascinated by that, and in Buddhism they say something similar. A lot of Buddhism talk about there being no self. So in nirvana, in emptiness, in no-thingness, there is no self. There is just that emptiness, which doesn't appeal to me, and I don't think really that's possible. I don't think that's actually true. But a lot of Buddhists believe there is no self. So you exist in this emptiness without a body, without an identity, without nothing but this emptiness, which doesn't philosophically seem very possible, doesn't seem reasonable to me. So I go along with the idea of self resting in the nothingness, the being, the ground of one's being resting in nirvana, or you could say God, or you could say the One. And so she was very interested in that kind of thing, and the idea of nirvana, emptiness, and so forth. Now it's interesting that I think in her 50s or 60s she began to suffer from Alzheimer, where she was losing her memory. And her husband eventually wrote a book on what it was like to live with his wife undergoing Alzheimer's. And he said that his wife Iris, and Iris was a film, it was made into an actual film, I think it was a Hollywood film. But anyway, he said that his wife, in that kind of nothingness, in that absence of memory, was more herself in a certain way than when she was in her memory. So what he was saying, he was trying to say that the person he knew as Iris, that in herself she could be herself with very little notion of identity existentially, and in terms of Buddhism she could be to him a person with very little projection of identity or ego. So I think for him, I think he was saying in admiration of her, or in respect of her, in her own person, that when she was not functioning from an ego identity memory, she was more herself than say himself operating as an ego with a very definite sense of identity. And he felt that was the quality he liked about his wife, whereas he was completely different from that. So I think that's a very interesting case study, as it were, of the ways you can look at the idea of deconstructing one's philosophical or metaphysical or spiritual identification, as it were, in your consciousness, and even drop the idea of the one, even drop the idea of the self. And so they talk in Buddhism about mirror-like wisdom, or the diamond body. So when you enter nirvana, you're pure crystal, your body is pure crystal. The light just shines through the crystal, and the clear light of the one mind. And so I think that's a similar idea, that it's no use looking in the mirror for yourself. There is no reflection. So if I look out now at the tree, I can see the tree not as the language, not as the identity, not as the memory or the consciousness of the tree, but simply as the form or the object that we call a tree. So when the child's running around, it doesn't know what it's seeing. It doesn't know the world we live in. It doesn't know the universe we live in. It doesn't know the identity and ego we know. It doesn't know anything. And yet it's intelligent, it's full of life, and reflecting everything with a kind of innocence and freedom. And I think even though the child may or may not be in a spiritual dimension, as it were, it's a very good example of that philosophy. And it's the same with nature. When you see animals running around, it's a similar idea of that kind of innate freedom. And if you start from the ground, as it were, if you start from, say, looking at reality, if you look at reality, say, as this universe, so our body, our physical body is part of the universe is, say, reality. And in science they say, well, if you take everything away, if you go back to the Big Bang, before the seed idea, as it were, before the seed, then there's nothing to say. There's actually nothing there. And if you go back in your consciousness, in your language, in your history, and your beliefs, and you go back through your life to childhood, and you then say, well, there was nothing there. But you know that there was something there. There must have been something there in the child that makes it fully conscious. So I would say when you go back to the Big Bang and back to the seed, there must have been something there. I mean, it makes sense that there's something there. So if you take the idea that what we call nothing in the child, then that nothing isn't literally nothing. It's only nothing compared to something. So language is something, ego, identity, memory is something, and seeing beyond that, or before the origin of that, you say there was nothing there. But we know that there was a lot there in the child. And I would say the same thing, that with the universe, there's something there. I mean, whatever that is, it is what it is. And we know that language is built up in consciousness, in the very dawn of the human species, the language came into the animal body, the human animal body. Consciousness came into that and built up a language, built up an identity, built up a culture. And you build it up. And but there's an intelligence behind it. The human being's intelligent, and it builds up the language. So I would say there's an intelligence prior to the Big Bang. There's an intelligence prior to the language in the child, and that makes philosophical sense. There's an intelligence, call it an intelligence. That means that somebody thought it up, somebody created that. And I say somebody, I mean, not just a single entity, but, a intelligences, as it were, spiritual intelligences, you might say, created the universe. And just like human intelligences created language and culture and history and civilization. And that makes absolute sense to me. So it's not as if the one or the source of what we're talking about, the source of universe, the source of the human being, the source of language, or the source of other dimensions, or the psyche. So, to simplify and say the one, I think that then, from that, you really can't say much. It's as if we have to settle for something that is prior to what we can actually reflect on, prior to what we can actually think about in our consciousness. And so you could say that in our consciousness we can develop many different ideas about self and the universe and reality. We can have many different philosophical ideas, and they can be more or less infinite in our consciousness. I mean, there have been thousands of different philosophies, thousands of different beliefs. And in the end, you either settle for a belief that's based on language, or as the one, as God, you posit something other than language, other than belief, other than a system of knowledge. So something that's not knowledge, something that's not memory, that's not ego, that's not identity. And therefore you come up with the idea that self is not that. And if self is not knowledge, and self is not infinity, and self is not a structure of belief, then self is nothing. Self is one. So if you walk around or live as one, and that's not a matter of language, then you never talk about it. Nobody knows that that is what your philosophy is, as it were. Of course, it's not a philosophy, but let's put it this way: the place you live, the place you are, where the self rests, is one, and that one is the one of everything. You could say the one is the one. It can't, the one is always the one. Any universe, any dimension, wherever you are in the world, it's always one. It doesn't depend on identity. In a dream you have an identity. You go to a foreign country, you have an identity. You have an identity within the family. So, hypothetically, if you think of a child growing up without language, then what would that mean? I mean, of course, there are quite a few strange states, as it were, like autism, for example. People don't quite understand autism. And somebody like R.D. Laing, the psychiatrist, he wrote a book called The Divided Self, and he was very interested in schizophrenia and also people that were experiencing the world in what he calls an alienated state, which is part of existentialism. That alienated state of the self, feeling that it's nothing. That when that person's in a room, they feel that to other people they're nothing. They're so alienated and divided that they feel that they're not identity, that they're not knowable to the other people. So that's, again, a kind of mental condition. And of course autism could be quite similar to that. The autistic person, their sense of self isn't identifiable to the world around them. So you can't really compare yourself. If you have an identity that everybody understands, like, oh, you're normal, you're one of us, we can understand your identity, no problem. But if they meet an autistic person and they can't identify with them as a person, then what is going on within that autistic person? So there's lots of different things going on that may reflect philosophically what it might be for a person, a self, to sense itself as nothing, to sense itself as an absence from the world, an absence from consciousness, an absence from identity, an absence from other people. Which is quite fascinating and quite challenging. And another thing that's interesting is, when we say somebody is ill, they've got a mental illness like autism, not mental illness, but say they're autistic or they're schizophrenic or they've got Alzheimer's, etc., and we feel sorry for them because they're not like us, that they're in a different state of mind. Maybe they're cut off, or they're isolated, they're lonely, that they must be suffering, they must feel they must be in a negative state, because people assume that being ordinary, normal is a good place to be. I mean, you want to be sane, not insane, as they say. You want to be normal, not abnormal. So they're projecting onto to people this kind of abnormality. And even science and the evolutionists see the whole spiritual process, the religious process of self-inquiry and inquiry into the nature of reality and God in a spiritual sense as being delusional. I mean, people seriously think that the people that dabble, as it were, in any form of magic and religion and spirituality, that is a kind of abnormality, that is a kind of dissociation, and therefore a kind of mental disorder. That's how they actually think. And of course it's science that's diagnosing autism, it's science that's diagnosing Alzheimer's and making conclusions about the state of identity, the state of the self, and whether it's good or bad, and whether we should feel sorry for people or that we should, in a sense, genetically engineer people so that they don't get into these particular states. So you could say, in terms of what they call the God gene, they're saying there's a religious gene or a God gene. Are they going to genetically engineer the genome and eliminate what they think is the religious gene because they think it's dissociated and demented? And it's quite possible that they actually will do that. But of course, spirituality has nothing to do with the physical body. Spirituality has nothing to do with the psyche, and spirituality has nothing to do with consciousness. So there's absolutely no way that they can control and interfere with spirituality. And that's the beauty of it, because spirituality, you could say, is our only way out. And that is what the Buddha said, it's our means of liberation. So no ego-centered belief system, no ego-centered scientist, no ego-centered anybody can control the forces of nature in the widest sense of the word. They can control a limited amount of what they know about, a limited amount of knowledge. So yes, I mean, in a sense, you could say that the truly spiritual person is a kind of endangered species. And what will it be like 100 years from now? What kind of mentality will scientists have? When people don't like something, for example, where I live, on my walk, I see dozens of grey squirrels. They're everywhere, dozens of grey squirrels. Everybody likes them, they feed them, they come up to you. So it's really part of being here in the park and the river. Part of that is really the joy of experiencing the grey squirrels. Now, in certain parts of England, they're killing all the grey squirrels, because the grey squirrels are, when they come into a territory, they push out the red squirrels, and there aren't that many red squirrels anymore in England. And so people are actually killing all these grey squirrels. It's a policy, it's a political policy, and they are allowed to kill all these grey squirrels and bring the red squirrels in. That's human beings doing that. What kind of mentality is that? What kind of conservation is that? What kind of ecology of what? What kind of conscience is that? What kind of, I mean, it's just monstrous to me, absolutely monstrous. And that's what people are like. Genocide, they commit genocide, and they think that's a political policy. And as I say, what will scientists do in 100 years to people that are spiritual? Will they force you to undergo some genetic engineering? Who knows what they're capable of? And it's a very serious thing. You've got the Inquisition in the Catholic Church, and throughout the ages, all the spiritual people like the Sufis and the Kafirs and the Gnostics They're all killed. So anything they don't like, anything that isn't like them, they don't like the grey squirrels, get rid of them. They don't like the Aboriginals, get rid of them. They don't like the Native American Indians, get rid of them. Or put them on a reservation, lock them up. It's crazy. And that kind of insanity, I mean, that's real insanity. I mean, that's real madness. And yet that's normal. Totally normal. And in the history of the human being, that is normality, to kill other people. That's absolutely normal. You could say, like the Middle East, you could say there are many reasons why people might be killing each other in the Middle East, but the fact is they're killing each other. I mean, whatever the reason is, human beings seem to enjoy, to like killing other people, just like they like killing grey squirrels or whatever it is. Oh, there's a reason because we like red squirrels. No, you like killing things. You kill squirrels, not because you love the red squirrel. And that is, you might say, underneath these policies in consciousness, in the conscious mind of the ego, in the conscious mind, you can justify anything, but the actuality is you're killing things. You're killing nature. You're messing around with the genetic code. You're messing around with the atomic structure. You're messing around with the nuclear structure. You're messing around with the laws of nature. You're messing around with the brain. They won't leave anything alone, these people. And they're motivated by a kind of psychopathology that is normalized in the hierarchy. It's normalized in the people that run society, the institutions of society. They get away with murder, literally. And they're not leaving children alone. Meddling with their thought processes, trying to interface the mind of a child with the computer, and all the animal experiments. No, to me the motivation for killing anything is that those people, that belief, that policy, they like killing things. Simple as that. Simple as that. In the same way, people like controlling other people, manipulating other people. Don't care what the reason is, they like doing that. People like telling other people what to do, telling other people how to think, telling them what state of mind is acceptable. If you don't believe this is a physical universe, if you don't believe that this is all there is, then they put you in a firing squad. I mean, that's the mentality of these people like Richard Dawkins at Oxford. I mean, that's the mentality of this kind of evangelical fundamentalist. I mean, really dangerous person, and yet he has a chair, a professor, a chair in Oxford. And Oxford's supposed to be the oldest and most prestigious university in the world, going back to the 12th century. And I know all about that. I mean, I've met people there, and I met someone very similar to Richard Dawkins, Colin Blakemore. He was the head neurologist, and he was doing all these animal experiments. And I spoke to him about religion, and he just you know, wouldn't listen. No, I mean, it could be dangerous to be a spiritual person, not a religious person, not part of an institution, but just being a spiritual person. Because that's what the Sufis were. That's what the Zen Buddhists are. The Zen Buddhists come out of the monastery, live near the monastery. They're just people, they're spiritual people who have entered Satori or Nirvana. And no, you're alone with your spirituality, you're alone, as I say, with the One. There's no outside security in that. It's not a protection. Like if you're part of a religion, you're protected by Jesus, you're protected by God, you're protected by the saints. But in my philosophy of self as the One, there is no protection. There's simply the freedom and the beauty of being innocent, of being free. That's it. There's absolutely no way that I would defend myself, because there's nothing to defend myself from. And if you were taken into an interrogation place, if I was taken into an interrogation place, and they say, well, we hear you're a spiritual person, and do I say yes or no? And if I said, well, not exactly, I mean, that's a label, but I'm just myself. And they said, well, what is your belief? You can't just be yourself. What's your belief? You're a spiritual person. You know, we want to know whether you believe in the physical universe or you believe in God or whatever. And I say, well, there's nothing to say. That is my philosophy. There is nothing to say. In the One, there is nothing to say. But of course they want you to confess that you believe in something. You can't just be nothing. Because there is nothing. I mean, for them, there is no such thing as nothing. You know, i.e. what's before the Big Bang? Well, there can't be nothing, so they're not even going to say there's nothing. So, I mean, philosophically, there is no philosophy of the One. There is no philosophy of nothing. Which makes me laugh, actually. So it's not like I would die for my philosophy, because there is no philosophy. You know, like people in religion, they're martyrs, aren't they? In Buddhism, they kill themselves in Buddhism for political reasons, and the martyrs and all of that stuff. I mean, I don't agree with any of that type of thing anyway. And I think spiritually, you don't represent yourself as anything, and you don't defend yourself against anything. So there's nothing to confess. But of course they won't leave you alone. I mean, if you say, I just want to be left alone, I don't want to participate in your regime, whatever that regime is, Nazi or scientism or whatever it is, you know, I mean, in any period of history, I want to be left alone. The Zen, he lives alone, or she lives alone. They just live alone. And the Sufi lived alone, and you live alone. But they won't leave you alone. You live in a particular country, and you're their property. I mean, they psychologically, physically own you. You're their property. You're their subject. You're their whatever. So there's nowhere to go on the planet where you can be left alone. Because these people, these predators, they hunt you out. They won't leave anybody alone. They'll hunt you down. Because you're not one of them. And it's not a refuge. I mean, I don't feel being myself, alone with myself, in the one, as it were, which means just being myself on my own, alone. There's no refuge there. Not in this world, there's no refuge. I mean, if you were like Buddha, you went to another level, another dimension in the one, yes, you could say there is a way out. But I don't know that myself, but he could say there's a way out from the human condition. I can't say, I can say that I can function with a minimal amount of consciousness. I don't have to have a formalized identity to live in the world. But I'm not absolutely free in that sense. So, in a sense, that although I'm secure in myself, I'm not absolutely secure. And you could say in another way, I'm not absolutely free while existing in the human condition. Anyway, as Ibn Arabi said, that the Sufi, that instead of saying self in the one, he would say the alone with the alone, to be alone with the alone. And that's fairly neutral. That's like so basic. I think that's a very, very basic thing you could say, alone with the alone. I think that's a very good way of saying it.